Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Whenever we talk about the ultra-wealthy, and specifically when we talk about Jeffrey Epstein, the conversation, it usually revolves around the spectacle of it all.
Yeah, the flashy stuff.
Right, the private island, Little St. James, the massive townhouse in Manhattan, the private jets. It's all these highly visible displays of power. It's almost like we get distracted by the shiny objects.
Which is exactly what people like that want. The spectacle is a distraction.
Exactly. But today, for this deep dive, I want to do something a little different. I want to ignore the mansion and the island for a second and look at the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
Invisible infrastructure.
Yes, exactly. Because we have a stack of documents here today for you. These are transcripts from investigative reports specifically referencing a breakdown by the Sun. And this material reveals something much darker and honestly much more mundane than a private island.
We're talking about the shadow inventory.
Right, the shadow inventory. We are doing a deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein's secret storage lockers. And I know storage lockers sounds like one of those reality TV shows where people bid on abandoned junk, but this isn't that.
No, definitely not.
This is about a deliberate engineered system designed to hide the worst crimes imaginable from the FBI.
It really challenges the narrative that he was just this chaotic predator. Because when you look at these documents, what you see is a man who treated the concealment of evidence like a literal business operation.
So the mission for today is to unpack the specific shadow inventory for you. We're going to look at what he hid, how he moved it right under the nose of the police, and the lingering mystery that the sources leave us with, which is frankly terrifying.
It really is.
The question of whether this evidence was ever actually recovered by authorities.
That is the question that keeps me up at night regarding this whole case. Yeah. Because, as we'll see, the system he built was incredibly effective.
Let's start with the mechanics of this, because the timeline here is crucial. The popular story, the one we all kind of know, is that the police raid happens in Palm Beach in 2005, and they find what they find, and that's the evidence.
Right.
But these sources suggest the game was rigged way before the police even knocked on the door.
That's the critical piece of context here. The source material highlights a long-standing suspicion among investigators that Epstein was actually tipped off regarding that very first police raid on his Palm Beach mansion back in 2005.
Tipped off, so he knew the raid was coming.
It certainly appears that way from the reporting. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't just panic and start shredding papers himself. The reports detail a full cleanup operation.
Wow.
Epstein reportedly paid private detectives to physically go into the mansion and remove equipment and incriminating items before the police arrived.
Wait, hold on. Private detectives. Can we just pause on that for a second?
Yep.
You can hire a licensed private investigator to go into a house and remove evidence of a crime. Isn't that just straight up illegal?
It's certainly obstruction of justice if they know what they're moving and why they're moving it. But think about the layer of protection that buys you.
Right.
He's not moving the boxes. He's hiring professionals, people who know how to handle sensitive materials, people who are discreet to sanitize the scene.
It's essentially outsourcing the cover-up.
Exactly. And it speaks to the resources at play here. If you or I were worried about a police raid, we'd be running around trying to hide things under the mattress.
Yeah, flushing things down the toilet.
Right. But he hired a team. But the real question is, where did they take it? Because you'd think if you have something truly damning, you burn it. You destroy it.
That's the movie logic, right? You throw the gun in the river, you burn the tapes.
But he didn't. He stashed it. The financial records cited in our sources indicate that Epstein leased at least 6 different storage units. And look at the dates on these records. He was leasing a unit in Florida starting in 2003, and he held on to it all the way until 2019.
Wait, 2019, that's the year he died.
Correct. He held on to this specific unit for 16 years.
That is...
Through the first investigation, through the plea deal, through his years of so-called rehabilitation, through the social climbing in New York, right up until his final arrest and death.
That is baffling to me. Why keep it? If you got away with it in 2005, why are you still paying for the locker in 2015? Why keep the evidence that could bury you?
That ties into the psychology of power and leverage, which we'll definitely get to. But before we dive into the why, just look at the how much. There is one financial detail in these records that I think is the most cynical part of the whole story.
You mean the cost?
The monthly payments. Yeah.
I saw that in the transcript. The transactions show he was paying around $140 a month for one of these units.
Think about that. $140.
It's nothing. It's literally a rounding error for a guy like that. He probably spent more on lunch on a Tuesday.
But think about the return on investment there. He spent millions on high-powered lawyers. He spent millions on settlements. But the most effective insurance policy he had, the thing that kept the physical proof of his crimes away from the FBI for over a decade, cost him $140 a month.
It's so low-tech. I think we imagine these guys having encrypted servers in a bunker in Switzerland or something. But he used a local self-storage facility.
Because it works.
Right.
Self-storage is ubiquitous in America. It's anonymous. You pay your bill automatically, and nobody checks what's in the box. As long as the check clears, the door stays locked. He utilized a facility in Palm Beach, but the reports also mentioned rented lockups across the country.
Oh, so it wasn't just one locker in Florida.
No, it was a decentralized network. If one location gets compromised, you have backups. It's a redundancy plan for blackmail and evidence.
Okay, so we have the method down. Get a tip-off, hire pros to move the stuff, put it in a cheap metal box, and pay the bill on autopay for 16 years.
Exactly.
But now we have to talk about what was actually in the box. Because the inventory list from these records, I mean, chilling is the word the source used, but that feels like a massive understatement.
It is deeply disturbing. And I want to warn you, listening, we have to be specific here to understand the gravity of the situation. But the details are grim. The inventory included photographs, specifically unseen nude photographs believed to be of Epstein's victims.
Unseen meaning the public hasn't seen them, and likely the police hadn't either at that point.
Correct. Along with that, there were videotapes and DVDs explicitly described as sexualizing teenagers. And perhaps most damning of all documents referred to as sex slave manuals.
Oh, stop there. Sex slave manuals. That phrase, that implies something totally different than just serial abuse. Manual implies instruction. It implies a system.
Precisely. You don't write a manual for an impulse. You write a manual for training.
Yeah.
This suggests a franchise model of abuse. It implies that he was either training victims to recruit others, which we know happened, or he was documenting his methods to teach someone else. It systematizes the horror.
That makes my skin crawl. It turns it into a corporate procedure.
It does. And alongside the paper and media evidence there was hardware. 3 computers and copies of hard drives were listed in the inventory.
Which, if we're talking about 2005 or 2006, that's where everything is. The emails, the contacts, the flight logs.
Right.
But what I found so strange, and I really want your take on this, is the other stuff in the inventory. Because it wasn't just a box of evidence. It looked like almost like a go bag.
It's a bizarre mix. I totally agree. You have the incriminating evidence, but then you have items that look like preparation for a getaway or setting up a new identity. The inventory lists more than $2,000 in cash, a concealed weapon permit.
And a Harvard ID card.
That's the one that really sticks out, isn't it?
It really does. I mean, if you're on the run, why do you need a Harvard ID? Is he going to try to check out a library book while fleeing the FBI?
No, I don't think it's for the library. If we try to connect this to the psychology of who Epstein was, the Harvard ID is a totem. It's a symbol of legitimacy. Remember, his whole scam, his whole persona, was convincing people he was an intellectual, a scientist, a man of intense importance.
So even in his escape kit, he needs to have that badge of honor.
It's a psychological shield. A Harvard ID says, I belong to the elite. If you're trying to restart somewhere or talk your way out of a tricky situation, having proof of connection to an elite institution is a powerful tool. It's social engineering kept in a wallet.
So the locker is basically an identity kit. Money, gun, permit, prestigious ID.
Precisely. And then you have the other layer, the items that speak to the operation itself. The inventory included a list of masseuses in Florida. It included lab results. And then sex toys, body massagers, and women's lingerie.
It's such a chaotic collection of stuff. You've got the trophies, the photos and videos, which implies he wanted to keep them to look at. You've got the blackmail material, the manuals. Then you've got the escape kit. And then the operational stuff, like the list of masseuses.
It suggests a man who was hedging his bets against every possible outcome. He was prepared to run, hence the cash and the weapon. He was prepared to restart his operation, hence the lists and the manuals. But he was also completely unwilling to let go of the record of his crimes. And that is a pattern we see in serial offenders over and over. They keep trophies because they value the memory of the control they had more than they fear the risk of being caught.
Even at the risk of keeping it in a $140 a month locker?
Arrogance is a hell of a drug. He likely believed he was untouchable or that his system of private detectives was foolproof. And the terrifying thing is, For a long time, it actually was.
Well, and it wasn't just Florida, right? This is where the story gets even bigger and more logistical, because the sources mention emails, and these emails suggest this wasn't just about cleaning out the Palm Beach mansion.
No, the scope was international. The emails detail conversations among Epstein's staff about logistics for Little St. James, his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
So now we're talking about moving stuff across borders.
Exactly. And they weren't talking about moving patio furniture. They were explicitly discussing moving computers and CDs from the island into these hidden lockups in the U.S.
Okay, let's pause and think about the logistics of that for a second. You are on a private island. You have computers full of highly illegal evidence. You have to pack them up, put them on a plane or a boat, get them through U.S. Customs, and then transport them to a storage unit in Florida.
It's a massive, massive risk.
It's a huge risk. Why not just throw the computers into the Caribbean Sea? The water is right there.
That is the key question. Why take the risk of shipping incriminating hard drives through customs? It proves that the shadow inventory wasn't just a panic dump. He wanted to keep this data. He needed to consolidate it.
It sounds like a corporate relocation.
It essentially was. It shows intense coordination. It took staff to back pilots or captains to transport detectives to receive the goods people to manage the leases. It completely dismantles the idea that he was just a lone wolf acting on impulse.
Right.
This was an organizational effort to sanitize his primary locations, the mansion and the island, and centralize the risk in a third-party location.
Which brings us to the part of the deep dive that actually made me angry when I read it, the blind spot. Because you assume, okay, we have this list, we know about the storage units now, so the FBI must have seized it all.
And that assumption appears to be dead wrong.
How is that even possible?
Yeah.
The source says search warrants suggest U.S. authorities never raided these specific external lockers. How does the FBI raid a mansion and a whole island but miss the storage unit down the street?
It comes down to how search warrants actually work.
No.
They have to be incredibly specific. You can't just get a warrant for everything Jeffrey Epstein owns everywhere. You get a warrant for 72 Palm Avenue.
Okay.
If the storage unit is at a different address and you don't know it exists because it's rented through a shell company or it's just not on the immediate radar, you don't search it. You can't search it.
So the cleanup worked. The private detectives moved the stuff out of the house. The FBI raided the empty house, and the evidence sat safe and sound in the storage unit.
That seems to be exactly the case. The source is very specific here. They mention that the FBI recovered copies of 2 hard drives. But regarding the physical contents of these lockups, the boxes, the papers, the original tapes, the the weird mix of items we just discussed, it is explicitly stated that it is unclear if that material was ever found.
Unclear. That is a very heavy word in this context.
The FBI declined to say whether any external units had ever been searched. And the source raises the possibility that because these units weren't raided during the initial investigations, the material might have just remained there.
Which means what exactly? It could have been destroyed later or moved again.
Or, and this is what the source really posits, it could have been retained by Epstein's estate after his death. Remember, he paid for that unit until 2019. When he died, the ownership or control of the contents would typically pass to his estate.
To the executors.
Exactly, to whoever had the keys and legal authority.
That is a terrifying thought. Because if the estate gets it, they aren't the police. They don't have a duty to book it into evidence.
No, they have a duty to the estate. And if that evidence disappears, it just disappears.
And we aren't just talking about evidence in the abstract here. We are talking about massive potential leverage. The source mentions some very high-profile names in connection with this unseen evidence.
Yes. The transcript explicitly mentions Andrew Mountbatten Windsor Prince, Andrew, and Lord Mandelson. The suggestion is that the lockers may contain unseen evidence relating to Epstein and these figures. Now, to be clear, we're just reporting what the investigative sources state here.
Of course, we're just looking at what the documents say. But let's connect the dots here based on those documents. We have sex slave manuals, which implies training. We have unseen videos. And we have high-profile friends. If Epstein was training people to entrap powerful men and recording it,
then the contents of that storage unit weren't just souvenirs. They were ammunition. It completely explains why he kept them for 16 years. It explains why he risked shipping them from the island. You don't throw away your leverage. That box was his insurance policy against the very people he was associating with.
But his insurance policy essentially expired when he died. So now where is it? That's the black hole the source talks about.
Exactly. If the authorities didn't secure it, then it remained out there in the wild. It implies there is information out there. Information that could corroborate victims' stories. information that could implicate world leaders that simply vanished into the administrative chaos of his estate.
Or was quietly removed by someone who knew exactly where the key was.
That's the darker possibility. If you were a powerful person implicated in those tapes and you knew Epstein was dead, finding that storage unit would be your #1 priority.
It totally changes how you look at the whole justice process here. We think of the case as closed because he's dead, but if there's a storage unit's worth of hard drives and manuals that was never processed,
then the full truth hasn't been told. And consider the timeline again, 2003 to 2019. That covers the entire arc of his known criminal activity. That's the iPhone era. That's the era of digital cameras. If those lockers contained a continuous archives of that period and it wasn't seized, that represents a catastrophic failure of investigation.
it really highlights how money works in the legal system, doesn't it? It's not just about hiring good lawyers to argue in court. It's about hiring people to move boxes in the middle of the night. It's about renting space in the dark. It's about having the physical infrastructure to wait out the police.
Precisely. It highlights that financial resources allow for the preservation of leverage. He could afford to keep this evidence safe for 15 years. A regular person couldn't do that. And that help he had, the staff, the detectives, ensured that the truth was compartmentalized and hidden away.
It's a sobering realization. You want to believe that when the FBI gets involved, they turn over every single stone. But sometimes they miss the $140 rental unit down the street because they're too focused on the massive mansion.
Or they don't look for it until the trail has gone completely cold. And in this case, cold means the secrets might have died with him or passed into hands that have absolutely no interest in the public ever seeing them.
So let's wrap this up by looking at the big picture for you listening. We've found a few key things today pulling from these sources.
Right. First, the tip-off. Epstein seemingly knew the police were coming in 2005.
Yeah.
Second, the cleanup. He used paid professionals, private detectives, to sanitize his crime scenes before law enforcement arrived.
Third, the logistics. He used a network of cheap storage units to hide the overflow from both Florida and his private island, proving this was a massive coordinated effort.
And fourth, the inventory itself. A horrifying mix of abuse materials, manuals on how to abuse and escape tools like fake IDs and cash.
And finally, the failure. The strong indication that authorities never raided these specific units, leaving the ultimate fate of that evidence completely unknown.
That is the part that lingers.
That is the thought I just can't shake. We assume that if evidence isn't in a police locker, it's gone. But matter doesn't just disappear. Hard drives don't just evaporate into thin air.
No, they don't. They sit there.
So here is the final provocative thought for everyone listening. The source material leaves us with a giant question mark. If the authorities didn't raid these lockers, and if the estate had access to them after Epstein died, where's that chilling cash right now?
Is it in an incinerator? Is it in a shredder somewhere? Did someone buy the unit at a blind auction without knowing what was inside?
Or is it still sitting in a cardboard box in a climate-controlled room somewhere in Florida just waiting for someone to cut the lock?
It's a very disturbing possibility. But based on what we've read today, it's a possibility we have to seriously consider. The evidence of the century might literally be collecting dust in a strip mall.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's a heavy one, but understanding the machinery of how these things are hidden is the only way to understand how they happen in the first place.
Absolutely. Knowledge is the only light we have in these situations.
We'll catch you on the next one. Stay curious.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.